Richard, I like to think about what God is like. If I'm to believe in a God, I have to do that. And one of the problems I have is that if God is supposed to be the creator of everything, there are these things that Plato originally helped us to understand, like numbers, like logic, possibilities, that seem to exist necessarily, no matter what, so that God is unable to create them, and in fact, God is surrounded by them. There's an infinite number of these kinds of things, which seems to contradict the concept of God.
I agree with you. It does seem to contradict the concept of God, and my response to it is that there really are no such things as you mention. Let's see how the temptation arises as it arose for Plato. Plato saw there are many different tables, that he saw they all had something in common, so he imagined there was an abstract form of a table which, as it were, was instantiated in each of these particular tables but existed independently of them. Now, we may not be quite tempted along exactly the same lines, but there are similar temptations in our ways of thinking. For example, there may be a human sentence, "The king is dead." And this sentence may be uttered in different languages, "Le roi est mort," "Rex mortuus est," and so on. And we then think, well, this sentence is expressing something which exists independent of the sentence, a proposition. And this proposition would be true or false, as the case may be, whether or not any human had said it. So there are propositions, true ones, false ones, and they exist independently of human utterance. And then we think, well, perhaps we don't think the same of tables, but we do think the same of natural characteristics of objects like redness. There are a lot of red things, but what is there? But surely there would be a redness even if there had never been any red things, because there would be the possibility of things being red as opposed to other possibilities, and this would consist in the existence of the abstract object of redness. So we are tempted along similar lines, and the same problem arises. If these things exist independently of God, how can God really be in control of the universe? And my answer to that is that these things are fictions, useful fictions, but fictions nevertheless, and they can distort our way of thinking. That is to say, the only things that are true or false, really, are human, actually uttered sentences. To say that some proposition which someone had never uttered is true is just to say that if someone were to have uttered it, they would have uttered a true sentence. And you can boil down all talk about propositions, all talk about all abstract objects, including, in my view, numbers, to talk about what actual human beings do or would do under different circumstances.
Take mathematics. Take equations in mathematics that are equations. One side equals the other side. Yeah. Even if no one ever thought of it, because indeed, as mathematics has proceeded, new equations are discovered.
Of course. And that is because humans have invented, for good purpose, of course, invented arithmetic. And in inventing arithmetic, they have laid down certain rules for the use of the symbols which they have devised. And the necessities are necessities which follow from those rules, but they are human rules. For the arithmetic, it all follows from Peano's 5 axioms. For example, that one is a number, every successor of a number is a number, every number has a successor. No number, different numbers have the same successor, and one other one that I can't think of offhand. But these are rules. If you then lay down these rules, you can generate from these rules every truth of arithmetic. Okay, but you could devise a different arithmetic without any difficulty at all by dropping one of these axioms and replacing it by another. You could have an arithmetic in which two numbers have the same successor, two different numbers, and you might call, you clearly, it would be confusion if you used the same symbols, but you could invent an entirely different system of symbols in which there was one symbol and every successor of that symbol was a symbol, but two different successors had the same symbol, and then you would devise a different system of arithmetic. Now, our system of arithmetic is devised because it's rather useful for dealing with the physical world. It's useful since objects, as it were, stay intact on the whole. If you have 5 stones and add another one to them, the first 5 don't disappear. And therefore, it's useful to have a system of numbers which will enable you to describe what happens when you put groups of things with other groups of things. And our system is useful for that purpose. But suppose the world behaved in a very different way. Suppose it were the case that whenever you had what we would say 2 things, one added a third, then one of them disappeared. And suppose this was generally the case, then it would be useful to have a number system in which there was some symbol corresponding to 1, in which 2 plus 1 equals 2. Our world is not like that, so we don't have that system of numbers. So once one's drawn attention to the point that our arithmetic is a consequence of certain axioms, and that the formulae we derive are very useful for describing the way things behave, not merely the mundane example I took, but the more sophisticated laws of physics, then we can see that these truths are simply truths about the consequences of human conventions for the use of certain symbols, and we choose those conventions because those are the ones useful for our universe.
Hypothetically, if you believe that these abstract objects, these numbers, had some independent reality, would that give you great problems for the definition of God as you've had it?
Yes, I think it would, because this would imply that there were innumerable realities which were existing as just as real in existence as God himself. And even if you suppose that God is a logically necessary being and therefore is just as necessarily existent as these things, which I don't, but even if you did suppose this, he would be no more existent than these things. And those who follow that course then say, well, God inevitably creates these necessary truths. It's unclear to me how one could create a necessary truth, but anyway, they say that. Well, even if that is true, God clearly has no option, in their view, but to create those truths as opposed to other truths. So the question then arises as to why he should create those truths rather than any other ones. And one might say, well, that's his essence, he's made like that. But that postulates a very complicated being who has all these truths built into him, as opposed to a much simpler being who is just a personal being who is powerful and good and wise. But then you may say, oh, well, God only creates things because it's good that he should create them. But then, if it's good, in that case, there is a truth independent of God, that is good that God should create that 2 and 2 make 4, but not good that God should create that 2 and 2 make 5. So again, there are truths independent of God. So anything who can avoid that, as it were, cuts God down to size, rather, and doesn't make him fully in charge of the universe. And it means a lesser God than a God who is not dependent on abstract objects in any sense.